Hello, this is a listening project specifically highlighting the women's voice within the game, brought to you by the Football Supporters Association and Offside Media Productions. In this 6-part series, leaders of football fan groups and other trailblazers are joining me, Lynsey Hooper, to chat about the big issues facing fans right now. Today's episode is all about transparency in the women's game. And joining me to talk about this one is Debs Dilworth, the FSA Women's Game Network Manager, Nick Andrews-Gauvain, the Wolves Women Representative at the Wolves Trust, and Chris Paouros, co-chair of Proud Lilywhites, FSA board member and season ticket holder for Spurs men and women. Debs, I'm going to start with you because the FSA did this brilliant work, and after recommendations from the fan-led review of the women's game that's just been announced, it's going to have an actual independent review headed by Karen Carney, looking at audience growth, financial sustainability, existing structures in the women's game. So can you tell us more about why you think the fan-led review thought that this was needed?
Yeah, so the fan-led review, the Women's Game Network of the FSA contributed to the fan-led review last year. We presented to the panel. We took them through a series of slides and discussion points that we felt were pertinent to the women's game. And we also submitted an evidence document as well. But because of the different nuances in the women's game, it was felt that a separate review was needed to look at the nuts and bolts of how the women's game is working. So it was really important to have that separate review to give the women's game the space and time. And also for us as a network, it was important for supporters to come together and have a little bit more time to discuss those points as well and the recommendations that we might see fit. In the fan-led review of last year, supporters groups of the men's game had several years to sort of really discuss some of those points and finesse them. So it was felt that actually that was the best step forward and for fairness as well. And I think it's a really good golden opportunity for supporters to put through some key recommendations or suggest some key recommendations.
Well, hopefully they'll start ticking through all of the discussion points we're about to go through. In terms of transparency in football, Nick, what immediately springs to mind in the women's game for you when you think, I want to know more, I want more transparency?
There's a huge range of issues. I mean, for me as a Wolves fan, we've just seen our team have to move from where we were in Wolverhampton out to Telford because our aspiration is Championship football, and to do that, we need to have certain requirements for a stadium. But nowhere is that really clear and publicised everywhere, and it clearly explained what the application criteria is. I mean, because we start to play, it's not just done on promotion, part the playoff as well, but it's not just done on winning the league and promotion. There's a application criteria, there's stadium requirements and things like that, which if I went and Googled it, I couldn't guarantee finding it. Certainly not for this iteration of the Championship. For this season, what would Wolves need to do? Okay, that's fine. The management might know that, but I want to know that as a fan. I want to know what my club needs to be investing and doing to help sort of meet those criteria. And it's not there. It's not public knowledge. And that's one big concern for me. The wider sort of structure of promotions and sort of playoffs and things like that is another concern, and how that is all sort of designed. Those are the sort of the big concerns for me.
I imagine, Chris, for you, you're a Spurs supporter, and I imagine your experience in the men's game when you're on that side of the fence is that you know quite a lot about the club. You know about the runnings, you know about the deals, the lengths of contracts, the money that players are on. When you look at the women's team, do you feel you know that team and the financial structures as well?
I think the answer to that is no. And I think there's an interesting level of nuance here, because I think when we talk about the men's game, you've got a financial structures, as you put it, that work in a traditional sense of a business. Like you have money coming in and then money going out. And we know what the issues are with a lot of football clubs kind of, having a much higher wages to income ratio than any sensible business should have. I think what's more challenging in the women's game is that, in the women's teams, is that, broadly women's teams, particularly those in the WSL and the Championship are making an enormous loss. Now, you might just say, look at some of the major men's teams. They're making massive losses every year anyway, or maybe it's around kind of, owners taking money out, etc. But I think part of the thing there is that, we know football's very competitive. It's very, very guarded. No football team would ever publish any financials if they didn't need to, or publish anything about anything they're doing if they didn't need to, because they're all trade secrets, right? Paraphrasing slightly. And I think that's what we've got here as well. You've got basically saying, I don't want to tell you how much I'm spending here because actually it might give me some competitive advantage. And I'm not, I feel a bit agnostic about that, to be honest. But I think the problem is I only feel agnostic about it while it works. You see, because if you end up with some mismanagement where therefore you lose a load of money and then you have to cut your women's team adrift or do something, do something else, then that is going to be a problem. Exactly. And that is going to be a problem for me as a fan. I think what's also interesting is, what happened, we don't get what I want to know, sort of more information about the team and the players and all the rest of it. The amount of knowledge I have of some of the men's players is like, they're just things that I actually don't want to know half the time. And I wouldn't mind knowing even a fraction of that about the women's players and having that as a thing that you have, just in terms of. And I know that the data's not necessarily there, but we're building it. This is our year 3 in the WSL. The WSL's been, has been kind of a league in function for a number of years now. So there are stats and there is data. So I want to see that data model built on as well, because we're used to, as fans, consuming football from a data perspective. I can't move in the men's game for like XG ratios and what this heat map looks like. And some people really like that. I mean, I'm less inclined for that. I don't know why I'm making an argument for it, but I do think that, it tells you something and it creates kind of more sort of dialogue. So from that perspective, I want to see that kind of same investment in that data as well.
I'd love to have some stats, just anything above beyond sort of goal scorers. I listened to Chris Gadsby's Total Football Show. Sometimes he had to move his show to a Thursday night to allow the teams the chance to put the goal scorers up on a Monday, Tuesday. So therefore, and certainly for the midweek games, so he could actually tell us who scored the goals. And that we're not even at that level at some of the, certainly tier 4. So let's have where the goal scorers were coming from and things like that, who got the assists on the stats maps. And we don't need XG necessarily, but let's have some more of the details, please.
I think the stats relates to history. You need history to have stats. I actually know some very, very good statisticians, if I can say the word, that have been working in the women's game the last 2 or 3 seasons. But you need a good 5, 6, maybe even a decade under your belt to start getting some real meaty stats. So that will have to come. And it's just in line with the professionalisation of the game, I think. Debs, I know that you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think this is an interesting conversation because you're kind of starting to see the split in terms of potentially what supporters want or expect from a football club. So to go back to the licensing models and the transparency of those, for the WSL, for example, that used to be published where you could see the licensing requirements, and it then hasn't been published for maybe 4 years or so, if not slightly longer, 4 or 5 years. So, those kind of steps then make it impossible for people to really understand what is required. And then it's down to a bit of hearsay as well. So there's that. But then now you're going to start to have supporters in the women's game who want potentially different things, like you do in the men's game. And I think that's always been the case. But you will have some that care about the ownership. They'll care about the finances. They'll want to know the club's sustainable. You'll then have supporters that want the data, that want the stats about on-pitch activities, heat maps, etc., etc. You'll have supporters that really care about the matchday experience. So the mirrors in the toilets are broken, the pie's cold, there's no Bovril. So football clubs are going to have to start to see, as the game grows, that they're going to have to engage with fans on a lot of different levels. And I think this conversation is testament to that, as Chris and Nick have just kind of said about the data that they would be interested in. But on the licensing, we should definitely still be having more transparent approach. Like the fact that we've moved away from that again is worrying.
Why do you think we've moved away from? Why aren't the licensing requirements available?
I think that it was partly to do with as other partners came into the game potentially, and so you've got other information in there that might be more sensitive of nature and protective over commercial partners or stakeholders of other kinds, and then so it's subtly been kind of dropped without really realising actually what that does is then disallows a wider range of people to see those criteria and to see that licensing requirement. So there is something that the FSA is working on and has been working on in terms of trying to source this information again. And I don't think you even necessarily have to have some of the commercial elements in there, but you do definitely need the criteria and you could have a base level of information for supporters. I think I'm not necessarily sure it's been done in the sense of, oh, well, we're just going to hide this information away. It's probably just dropped off a never-ending workload. And then with the partnership element to it, it's then just not been shared. So, but it's our job as a supporters organisation to say, actually, we should have a right to that and we should have a voice and consultation around that, and it should be being released.
What does the word independence mean to you when you see that word coming up quite a lot, certainly in the fan-led review? Because, Chris, you've already touched on the dependency on men's teams for sustainability, something that you'd like to get away from. Is that what independence means to you in these terms?
It's really interesting, Lynsey, because I haven't figured out what I think on this.
And
I think what's interesting is that we're all on a bit of a... I know! We're all on a bit of a journey because on the one hand, I think I'd want to see the Spurs women's team... You know, philosophically, I want to see the Spurs women's team be its own organisation, not rely on anyone else, and continue to drive forward and improve season on season. But on the other hand, you have to be a realist and a pragmatist about the structures in which the Spurs women's team sits. And when you're sitting next to and trying to compete with, like Chelsea, for example, who have gone and spent £250,000 to sign a player, or so it's reported, because we don't necessarily know all of these things. Then actually, how do you then go and do that? But then how do you go and do that? Because, we were at a new stadium now. We're at Brisbane Road, the Leighton Orient Stadium. We'll probably get a few thousand people in there every home game. And actually, for a small football club, you could sustain that quite nicely doing that. However, we're talking about a global brand that has support all over the world. In the Proud Lilywhites, we've got members from Barnet to Buenos Aires to Brooklyn to Brisbane. And that's because they're Spurs fans and they're gaining that interest in the women's team now as well. And so, it's great that we've got a few thousand people going to Brisbane Road, and we'll build them on that, I'm sure. But then what do you do about sort of what that independence looks like? Because you're talking about a global brand. It's hard. I don't know.
I'm not necessarily... let's take football out of it. Let's look at the Wolverhampton Wanderers as a business. You'll have different arms, different offshoots that do different things. They all feed into the one big global brand. I hate the word brand, but that's what it is. And that's what comes out at the end happens to be football. That's their product. It just happens they do different things different ways. And I'm not necessarily... it is what you don't have to separate them personally. I think it is, being really corny and corporate here. It's one pack. Wolves is one pack. We just have different parts of the pack, but we just need to build the whole of the pack up so that it's all as strong as possible across the board. I want to see a WSL club, Wolverhampton Wanderers playing in the WSL. I want to see Wolverhampton Wanderers playing in the Premier League. That's what I want. That it's the strength. Therefore, I don't mind if it's a bit of interaction. I don't need it to be independent of that. What I do want, though, is an independent regulator overseeing some of this to make sure that that the governance is there properly for the whole game. And I think that is, for me, where the independence needs to be.
But it's easy for us to say, Nick, because we're fans of Premier League football clubs. And what happens if you're Lewis? I'd love to see Lewis in the WSL. But in the end, if they get there, how are they going to compete when you're talking about like literally playing up against Chelsea and now Liverpool are back in as well, etc. Like, what do you do? And you want to see it because you want to see something different. I don't want to just see the WSL mimic the Premier League, because actually one of the things we love about football is because it's unpredictable and David can beat Goliath, etc., etc.
Well,
you look at that in the FA Cup, though.
The story was such a fairy tale, isn't it?
Exactly. But then you look in the FA Cup, in the men's FA Cup, you still have those cup upsets. You do have it still sometimes in the women's FA Cup, not to the same extent.
One-off games, though. They're one-off games, though.
True. But I suppose it's how do you build it as well? It's how do you cap and regulate then? Because that's what we're looking at is realistically you're capping and regulating how much people. You go into the American model almost of everyone has the same amount of money almost, and is that what fans want? And that's not a criticism of how America do it. That's how their game's set up. Is that what fans really want? Because I think that's a different conversation again.
I'm going to pick out the word regulation that you used, and I'm going to talk about other forms of regulation as well. Regulation when it comes to referees, is that transparent enough? Do we know what's going on there? Because officials within the game are the last thing that have turned professional, certainly on the women's side. Diversity in the boardroom. Do we know who makes up the boardroom? Chris, have we got any LGBTQ plus members who are part of the governance of the game? Any ethnic minority groups that are? What do we know? Debs?
Yeah, can I just pick up a point in terms of independence? I know, and then I'll come back onto the regulation point. But yes. I think sometimes the word independence puts a bit of a fear into people, because then it's like you're cast out on your own and you're like working on your own way. I don't think anybody would suggest, or a lot of people would suggest, that any women's team that's aligned with a men's team should then suddenly be cast out on their own. But you can be independent and then be supported. Like, isn't that the best kind of relationship, where you have independence but you are supported by your partner? So ideally we want to work towards that and maybe have a more central funded pot, so it levels the playing field, so that we don't produce what is now happening, which is a mini Premier League, which is such a shame given the heritage and history of the game. So
on that point,
there's independence.
On that, to say
independence, not codependence.
Yes, because Chris, when she brought up Lewis as the example, and you're saying about any healthy relationship, when you're looking at that joint account in the healthy relationship, it's getting a bigger contribution, isn't it, compared to what Lewis would be? And so there's a class structure as well that exists within football on both sides.
Yeah. And then also, this is where it's interesting, and then we'll be interested in terms of the independent review into the women's game, because the modelling, you've got various different models within the women's game. You've got Durham, you've got Lewis, you've got the Premier League kind of association model. But I just kind of think sometimes, like, independence, it worries people, because then it's like, oh, right, the men's side will just go see you later and then won't help. But the idea is for the men's game to still support the women's game, but to not have this tiring influx of money, which then creates this imbalance. So the brilliant club that is Lewis then struggled to get into the WSL, when actually that's a shame. So on your point,
can I ask about the central pot though, and how would that get administered? So does that mean that, like, using Lewis as the example, Lewis would get more money than Wolves?
I think this is the conversation, though, that needs to be had in and around independent regulation, and then how that sort of fits in terms of the women's game. And this is why the independent review into the women's game is so important, because those are the conversations, and sort of like the nuts and bolts of how it would work needs to be discussed, so that we don't just follow blindly a model that then disadvantages and sort of it flies in the face of the history and heritage around the women's game, where you've got Donny Bells, Charlton, Sunderland, all these clubs that have had such Fulham, Notts County, like all these clubs that have had such success, and then suddenly found themselves way down the scale. So I think this is why this review is so important.
Am I also sensing here then that the word salary cap could be introduced? Something that I think across the men's game there's a lot of the fan base that would be really eager for that to have once been introduced. We're sort of at the point of no return. But is that an opportunity in the women's game? But we would need more transparency over wages. I mean,
I don't think you can have a... Yeah, I think that's right, Lynsey. But I think I'd feel really uncomfortable having a salary cap in the women's game and not in the men's, because we're just basically then just saying to women, it's okay, like, you're all right. You should be grateful for playing football because you're a girl, and you're getting a decent salary. So thanks very much. So I think if you had a salary cap, you'd have to kind of apply it across both games. But you're right. I mean, the whole horse has probably bolted there.
And also in terms of like equality across the club, so it's just like you need to. Often something that gets peddled is, well, so like for the FA Cup, for example, well, we couldn't possibly do equality in terms of pay and prizes and whatnot because the men's side brings in way more sponsorship and blah blah blah. But in a family, you would ideally share, and it would just go equally to everybody. So again, it's like these kind of structures need to be looked at in the men's game. And I agree with Chris, you just couldn't at this moment in time, unless you're going to do it in the men's game. It would be so bad to do it with the women's game, considering how hard they've had to fight just to get 30 grand a year or 35 grand a year, 60 grand a year, whatever it is. You know, like I would agree with that point as well, Chris.
Just to round off, because we're speaking about what we can't see at the moment, we want to see more of. In the next 12 months, what do you think we will see more of in terms of transparency in the women's game, starting with Chris?
I think that we will see more. We talked a little bit about data at the beginning. I think potentially, specifically from the Premier League clubs, you're going to know more about the players, hear more stories. You know, you get much more around the social media. So I think we'll know more about our teams. I think slowly we might hear a bit more about the finances, particularly as this independent review of the game comes in, because I think we're used to understanding football finance. So I don't see why we wouldn't hear more about the finances. I think the governance is going to be interesting because, you know, like you could argue, I think, you know, the Spurs Women's Board is basically the board of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and we know all about that. So even knowing that, I think, is interesting, and I don't know how much we know about that from the other teams. So look, I think off the back of the Euros, it's interesting. I think off the back of the Euros, it's a real opportunity to drive these conversations because you've got more interest in women's football. You know, we feel like we've all got a stake in it. You know, the biggest achievement in English football for 60 years was delivered by our women's football team, and that's not to be sniffed at. And you know, the greatest joy we get this season might be from our women's football teams as well. So I think that it's an opportunity to kind of drive more transparency.
Debs?
Yeah, so I totally agree with what Chris has just said, and I think we will see more transparency, particularly in and around governance and finances. I also think what we will see is our current supporters groups and a growth in supporters groups being empowered to hold their club to account, and that's really important because that will drive some of the sustainability and changes in women's football that are potentially needed to make sure that the game exists in 50 years' time and in a more powerful position than it currently is. So yeah, I genuinely think we'll also see more consultation with supporters. I'm sure of that.
Nick?
I'm going to agree with Debs and Chris on all what they said. The other thing I would certainly like to see more transparency, and it seems really minor, but cup draws, video documented, shared. I know obviously Faye Crothers does have some of the draws on the FA Cup on her show on TalkSport, but the Birmingham County Cup draw has been done today. Wolves have got to buy into the next round, but it just came up as as an image on Twitter. I don't know how it was drawn. We've got to buy. I looked through, and I'm not going to say anything about who's been drawn, who's not got a tie, and who's got a buy. But it looks seeded to me. But no one's saying anything. How have those draws been made? Similar with the FA Women's National League Cup and the Reserves Cup. Let's have those more transparency about how the draws been made. It doesn't need to be hugely sort of choreographed, huge UEFA style video sort of presentation about it all. Just somebody standing there with some ping pong balls, pulling them out, going, right, Wolves have got West Brom at home. Let's have it. Let's have that. That will be really nice. Some really simple transparency, but really easy. It's that first steps, and too often we're missing out those. And that's some of those simple terms. I agree on top of what Chris and Debs have already said.
Minor and major issues. We're just going to address all of them when we've got time at some point. We will close this conversation here, though. Thank you very much to Debs, Nick and Chris. If you've been listening in at home and you want to share some views, you can comment below. We'd love you to do so. Or you can get in touch on social media as well at We Are the FSA. Keep a lookout for the other Listening Project episodes too, covering lots of different topics, including the relationship between the men's and women's game and also safety online. Thank you for listening. See you soon.